Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Shillon. We're going to get started in about 15 minutes with this new episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to be talking about identity management and what should you host in a managed control plane with multi-tenants and what you should not host as a SaaS service, particularly when it comes to some of your crown jewels. So please wait another 15 minutes. We're going to get started soon. In the meantime, if you want to share what company you're with and your name so we can highlight you on the screen. And if you have questions regarding identity management and what to host on a SaaS service and not host as a SaaS service, please also put it into the comment section below. Start with a Q so we know it's a question as well. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll get started very soon. Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. This is Nick Shillon. We're going to get started about 10 minutes with this new episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to be talking about identity management and what to host as a SaaS, multi-tenant, what not to host as a SaaS. So stay tuned. If you have questions, start with the Q in the comment section below. Also, if you want to share you here, put your name and company so we can highlight you on the screen. We'll get started in about 10 minutes. Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining. This is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started in about 10 minutes with this episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to be talking about identity management and what to host and not to host on a SaaS managed control plane. So if you have questions, make sure you put it into the comment section below, start with a Q. And also if you want to share you here, put your name and company so we know you're here and highlight you on the screen as well. Stay tuned, and we're going to get started in about 8 minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us in this new episode of In the Nick of Time. We're going to get started in about 5 minutes. In the meantime, if you have questions, start with a Q so we can get ready for those. And also, if you want to share you here, don't forget to put your name and your company, because sometimes here's what we see. So I can highlight this if you want, but we don't get to see your name. So put that into the comment section as well, and we'll get started in about 5 minutes. Thanks. Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon. This is Nick Shalom. We're going to get started in about 3 minutes. As a reminder, please subscribe to the mailing list so you can get notifications for these events at inthenickofTime.tv. Also, if you want to subscribe on the YouTube channel, you can go on youtube.com/Nicolas Chalon. You're going to be able to subscribe. We're going to be releasing technical videos every Thursday or Friday. And that's going to be doing deep dives on Kubernetes, Service Mesh, a lot of pretty exciting things. So I'm sure you're not going to want to miss it. So you can also click on that little bell icon once you subscribe to be notified on your phone that the video is out. So you can do that. We're trying to get to 1,000 members. So if you don't mind also sharing maybe to two of your friends that you think will enjoy the content, that will be very awesome for you to do. We'll get started in about a couple of minutes. Stay tuned. Also, put your name and company in the comment section below so we can highlight you on the screen as well. Thanks so much. Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us today again. This is Nick Chalon, the former Chief Software Officer for the Air Force and Space Force. Wanted to share a few things today. We're going to be talking about identity management, also Atlassian, what happened also with their issues related to their clouds. But in the meantime, before we get started, I wanted to give you a few reminders. Please subscribe to our mailing list so we're not completely dependent on these great companies to reach out to you guys by subscribing. We have access to your email. We're not abusing of it. It's one email or two at best a week to notify you of the videos being released. We're going to be releasing every end of the week technical videos. The next one is going to be on why we believe that Kubernetes must be used, even if you think it's overkill. It's going to create a lot of debate. It's going to be interesting, but we're going to try to make our case as to why Kubernetes is a must in 2022. So that's the next video coming out this week. And then every Tuesday, we're going to keep our show with guests and do deep dives. You'll see we have a pretty cool lineup. I'll be announcing at the end of this episode the two next guests that we're going to be having for the next 2 Tuesdays. Today, we're going to be covering identity management, what to host as a multi-tenant hosted SaaS capability, what not to host as a SaaS. So that's going to be interesting as well. Now, we're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, youtube.com/Nicolas Chillon. So please share to a couple of your friends that you believe will like the technical deep dives and the DoD related content. We're getting very close. In 2 weeks, we went from pretty much 0 to 760. So thank you so much for subscribing. Also, you can hit the little bell button so you know that you can be notified of the new videos. So, like I said, at the end of this week, we're going to be publishing this technical video on Kubernetes. That's going to be fun. And then we're going to start doing deep dives on service mesh, GitOps, infrastructure as code, and all these things. Very, short but intense. I guess maybe too fast. I need to slow down a little bit when I talk. I'm being told, so I'm going to try to do that. To give you as much insight as possible. So again, the video we published, if you missed it last week, was a Kubernetes introduction video on helping you finally understand what Kubernetes is about and why it matters with some tangible point of data there. So check it out if you missed it. We just passed 1,000 views. I'm pretty excited about it. So thank you for watching it if you watched it already. All right, so wanted to remind everybody, if you finally want to get back face-to-face and you live in the DC metro, we're going to have this great conference, the F5 Public Sector Symposium at the Ritz-Carlton in Tyson's Corner in Virginia. So it's also virtual, so you can, of course, check it out virtually. But if you want to go back face-to-face and finally meet people again, that's the place to go. We're going to have a lot of people excited. I'll be speaking and sharing what are the 3 pillars for modern cybersecurity implementation. That includes, of course, zero trust, continuous monitoring with behavior prevention, and moving target defense with cattle versus pets and all the good stuff. So we'll do some deep dive in that keynote. That's going to be fun. So I hope to see you there if you're going to Tyson's Corner April 19th. So it's coming next week, next Tuesday. So and the same afternoon, I'll be back on the show. That's going to be an interesting day. So looking forward to seeing you if you are going to go there. Now, in case you were living under a rock for the last couple of months, you've seen the hacking group LAPSUS targeting multiple companies. There were some arrests, but I believe there's many people left to go after. But sadly, pretty concerning to see some of the code and the source code being targeted and leaked, both in Samsung, Microsoft, and NVIDIA. That's going to lead to significant 0 days. But a recent also breach was the company Okta, which obviously was targeted particularly because of the crown jewel aspect of identity management. And so there's a whole debate. And when I was in the Department of Defense, I was kind of pushing against using a SaaS capability for a few things. I believe in SaaS, don't get me wrong, but I also think that SaaS multi-tenant control plane are a massive risk to your cyber defense. And so there are a few things you should probably not, and you probably should not host as a multi-tenant SaaS capability. Identity management, of course, that's your crown jewel of your identities. That's a pretty pretty bad idea. So we're gonna debate about this today. And if you have different opinions, please make sure you ask questions and comment in the comment section below. But also, we're going to be talking about multi-tenant control plane on zero trust, so your policy enforcement point, and kind of the risk of effectively giving the keys to your kingdom to a third party company. Same thing when it comes to Git and your source code repo. Do you want to use a hosted version, or you want to bring it on premise or on your own clouds and control that ingress egress? Be able to use a proper software defined parameter in front of that to make sure you mitigate your risk. So we're going to talk about that kind of stuff today. It's going to be interesting. And for that, we're gonna bring a great guest that has a very deep background in identity management. So I'm gonna bring him on the screen right now. Welcome. I'm going to put you on top of me so people can see you. Good morning, good afternoon. Thanks so much. Yeah, good to have you on the show. We've been talking a long time, and your background, of course, being the co-founder and chief security, so CSO, but not the same kind of CSO. Not a chief software officer like me, but a chief security officer, the more common CSO, I guess, at Cloudentity, where you have, of course, 20 years of management and architecture experience across identity, security, microservice domains. And that's really, kind of the focal point of the discussion today is people that want to follow you. You're, of course, on LinkedIn. And that's the link there to reach out to you. But first, like I always do before we get into the real meet, Nathanael, if you can do a quick background of your journey and how you got here. And then we're going to start digging into some of the real meat. And I wanted to remind everybody, we already have a few questions, but make sure that you post the questions, starting with a Q, so we know it's not just a comment. We have a lot of people tweeting and things, so it's easier if you just use a Q to show that you're asking a question. So over to you for your journey, and then we'll dig into the real meat of the discussion.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Nicholas. I certainly appreciate the opportunity to come on your show and speak on the podcast. As we look at the journey, right, I think it's actually kind of interesting because I got sucked into IAM almost right from the get-go, right? Worked in comp sci, majored in comp sci, I guess is more accurate. Worked and majored there, and then I got pulled right into Boeing, working on JSF. Actually ended up building a lot of the initial PKI infrastructure for the Joint Strike Fighter as they were doing the bids out to, I think it was Lockheed and Boeing, if I remember correctly, at that point in time. And then they were brought together. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's a little bit of an ancient history now. Brought them back together and then built a lot of that initial, how do we authenticate and authorize different users, different partners, different customers, right, of the different data points that were being accessed and being produced as they rolled out that program. From there, it moved into Sun Microsystems, helping them establish, what became one of the fundamental IAM practices back in the early 2000s for defining the industry. And then kind of jumped around a little bit, a couple different startups that successfully exited, again, wrapped around IAM, got pulled into Imperva. Early on, one of their first couple dozen hires. And then as part of that, started to realize, we needed what's that?
No, go ahead.
Oh, my apologies. Yeah, we needed much better signaling. We need much more intelligence, right? We needed all of the cybersecurity. We needed all of the identity access management capabilities. We needed to munge those together, right, as different signals to make the most intelligent authorization decisions possible with the shortest time from authentication. And that really yielded Cloudentity. And we looked at how we can start to bring in more signaling, more intelligence, more capability into the authorization landscape. And that's where we are today. I lost audio, Nicholas.
Oops, sorry.
I'm
talking muted.
You're back.
Yeah, sorry. I have too many mute buttons, So, obviously, all the foundation of security around strong identities is so important, right? How do you get to a secure tech stack if you don't have strong identities, both on the what we call, for people that don't know too much maybe about identity management, the person entity side, the people, right, PE, and the NP side, the non-person entity side, the microservices or systems talking to other systems, which is so essential when you think of the modern warfare of JADC to join all domain command and control that the DoD is pushing to have kind of this Internet of Things of weapons connecting and talking and sharing data and pushing data and publishing, subscribing to events, and how do you do this securely, right, without strong identities, short-lived, certificate driven for NP, but then on the people side, of course, multi-factor authentication, but it's going beyond this now, of course, with the adoption of labeling. NIST is working on this publication of what they call the next generation access control, NGAC, which is kind of the evolution of ABAC, attribute-based access control, and LBAC, labeling-based access control. And the next generation access control will start, of course, mapping data and moving to data centricity and labeling data down to the cell level, and now mapping that to users and mapping these labels and enabling that granular access and segmentation of access to the right data. And for us, of course, in DoD, when you have classification levels and different need to know, very important to be able to do that down to the cell level, so the what could be secret rel, and the who would be TSSCI, and the mission partners with the NATO and other partners would only be able to see what they're supposed to see. That would be really the foundation of a modern 2022 and beyond network across the mission partners. That's kind of the big push that's been going on with the mission partner environment, part of the Air Force office as executive agent for the entire DoD. So let's start digging into some of the key components. We took a step back on the tech stack of identity. I kind of introduced a little bit the people and the computer non-person entity side. What are your key components for a strong identity stack?
It's a big question, right? Identity, as you pointed out, is really the center of everything. If you're going into that kind of zero trust landscape, the center of people, the center of non-people, non-carbon-based life forms, or I guess just carbon processors, as fairer, silicon and carbon processors. But if we look at it and we start to say, okay, well, identity starts with a user, and even if it's a user performing a transaction on behalf of, or a service performing a transaction on behalf of a user, right, it becomes fundamental to authenticate that user. And from that authentication, right, I have other things like KYC, know your customer, very popular for AML, anti-money laundering, as well as in the eKYC that's coming out of the OIDF Foundation. You also have user data management, user preference management, and then we get into this big world, right, of user privacy management. I'm sorry, we get into this big world of authorization. And authorization needs to take all of that data, and it needs to start to fundamentally discern what's important in that data, what's not in that data, what's not important. What else can we bring in? Meaning, is there an entitlements data store? Is there additional risk factors? Is there additional fraud engine, right, that I can bring forward and start to use that to consume and perform appropriate authorization decisions past that authentication point? And from my perspective, or even the industry perspective, what we're starting to see is the decoupling of those different things. And going back to your introduction, right? Do you want all the keys to your kingdom, stored in a SaaS? And the answer is probably not, right? Meaning, at least not your private keys. Maybe your data can be stored in a SaaS, but how do you access and unencrypt that data that's coming out of your users, of your privacy data, et cetera, right? I want to be able to own my own private keys, particularly if I'm in a heavily regulated or a very secure environment. Second part of that is like, what do I do with that data once I have it? And how can I continue to decouple all of these different functions? So we've got great SaaS platforms and great on-prem platforms, but they're really written from in the 2000s, right? They're typically big Java apps, right? That have we've seen a lot of problems, whether it's Log4j or Spring, right? Just in the last 30 days. That haven't been modernized the way that platforms for our services, right, that the DoD, et cetera, is producing. And so there's this fundamental disconnect of how do I bring a, kind of this big Java app into this microservices world? And the answer is I want to decouple. I want to start doing the same thing I'm doing to my big apps, right? Decomposing them, moving them into microservices for my identity management stack. And that means I'm going to take the user management piece, the user authentication piece, the service authentication piece, the authorization, the governance piece. I'm going to create those as independent services, right? So I can start to deploy those as close as possible to my end services, because edge computing, Kubernetes, microservice, right? We all know that's the future of development. So the question is, how do I get that ICAM, that important data, all the way down to the edge of those services?
So you just described kind of the massive tech debt, right, of some of these companies, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously being created way before microservices were a thing. They have to decouple and cut their monolith into smaller bytes, and that's pretty much the same thing we have to do for many of the legacy systems. So that's a pretty big lift. At the same time, I guess you see, because of that gap, right? You've seen open source communities. You're looking at SPIFFE, Spire, and many other things. Kind of take a stab at creating an identity management stack. You see, of course, multiple competitors also trying to build their own things. We started in the Platform One Air Force DevSecOps stack, using Keycloak because it was open source and free, but big Java monolithic tech stack, and pretty heavy and pretty lots of CVEs, right? So a lot of cyber issues there. So who are the top players? Obviously, you're a little bit biased like I am, but that's okay. If you look at, obviously your competition, of course, you're one of them. But who else is kind of waking up and starting to realize, hey, we need to start doing this kind of decoupling? And do you see others just keeping their head in the sand and kind of not realizing that this is a problem, and they keep delivering kind of this monolithic outcome? And what would be the end goal of an Okta, after you get breached? And I think that the way they handled, the breach was not that great. We still don't really know how bad it was. They gave numbers, but the hackers kind of disputed that, and they made a lot of claims. I guess I'm on the Telegram chat, where they share a lot of information, like many others, I'm sure. And when you look at the stuff that they describe, it seems they could have done much more damage than going after 2.5% of the customer. Right. So who is kind of leading, other than you guys, I guess? Who is leading on the market right now?
So if we took each of those categories I just laid out, right, and we said authentication. So authentication's always been one of those that's been a little bit broken out, right? So you've got like Hyper, TruSona, and about 265 other, authentication providers that do a really good job at strong authentication.
Yeah. And I look at those. Is there an open source play there, or is it just mostly commercial products?
It depends on, again, it depends on your company's capability to both absorb as well as to support, right, the open source pieces. And so, yes, there's a lot of open source products out there that actually do things like WebAuthn, that do a great job at it. But if you have, more rigorous demands, for example, lots of legacy applications you want to integrate into, things of that nature, right? The WebAuthn libraries coming from the open source community probably aren't going to do it for you. They're going to do an edge or kind of a proxy-based authentication model, and then you're still trusting what's happening all the way down.
Right.
I mean, that's a fundamental.
I was never a big fan of that proxy. People are always studying this in the DoD, studying it as a zero trust, construct. I just don't agree. I think it's great. I mean, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's just not zero trust. So
I'm with you. But if we look at even the first Google pieces, right, for Beyond.
Beyond Corp. Yep.
Those are all proxy based, right? That was just like, hey, we're going to push more proxies out and push them closer to the edge, which is great.
Yeah, but they had the device enforcement piece. People dismiss it a lot, but they had the Chromebooks and they had the YubiKeys on the device. I mean, they had a lot of additional things on the device that then people just forgot about, and just oh, look, Google is doing the proxy stuff, and they forgot about all the other stuff. They had a pretty stringent control of the device and the stuff they were doing there too. So. Yeah,
totally agree with you. But and that builds kind of like, what does the whole ecosystem look like? And again, taking those individual components, right? if I look at what zero trust is, and I didn't think the conversation was necessarily going to go this way, but it's authenticating and authorizing, right, everything that's in that transaction. It's the user that maybe made the request, the device they made the request from, maybe the client app that they logged into on their mobile phone. That client app needs to authenticate up to the API gateway. The API gateway is then going to take that data, pass it back to different microservices, and maybe in Kubernetes or otherwise. And then authentication and authorization has to happen at each and every step of the way there, right? The model that we're currently built, and this is just a widely adopted one, is I authenticate once, I have a long-lived token, right? And then I just kind of pass that data in the token around. I don't have any constraints or controls on those tokens. I'm just essentially blasting your PII and sharing it out to my different partners, my different
all these
customers, third parties, et cetera. And that's one of the problems we saw within the Okta breach, is that third party had access, and they had, unsolicited or, full access, I guess is a better way of saying it, to a number of potential partner accounts.
So how do you solve that? Do you put a wall in front of you obfuscate, you encrypt, you let the user define what they end up sharing with those companies? Or
well, yes, but it's actually bigger than that, right? So it's moving from these long-lived tokens, and when I say long-lived, I mean 30, 60 minutes. That's a long-lived token. To moving to very short-lived tokens, meaning tens or hundreds of milliseconds.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, because now you actually get to do different control types, right? It's no longer, hey, I trusted you once, but I'm going to re-verify everything that was in your initial token creation, right? When you authenticated, which is again probably your device. How did you authenticate? Was it biometrics? Am I willing to trust that for longer? All these different pieces, and I'm pulling that into the authorization discussion, because authentication is like this great point in time thing that happened once that we for some reason have explicitly trusted, for extended periods of time. If we remember the Twitter breach, right? They're publishing 90-day OAuth tokens. And so being able to say, exactly. I did authenticate, but now I want to bring that time into a very short duration. And I actually like to look to open banking. I think open banking did a really good job at saying, hey, here's a fundamental standard for how to secure APIs. It's called FAPI. It's part of the OAuth spec. But then I want to do what's called intent-based lodging patterns, right? I know it's a mouthful, to specifically authorize and authenticate a user for a transaction, transfer money. And I think that plays well into the DoD realm as well, Yes, I can get to the wikis without maybe an extensive authentication process, but as I get into finer grained things, I want to commit code into Git, or I want to do, more robust and more privileged activities within the infrastructure. Well, I need to start stepping up both the authorization capabilities as well as the short-livedness of the tokens.
And do you see that as an augmentation of the existing stacks? Meaning, someone could have an existing identity stack and kind of build a product on top that would provide kind of this, so you have to rip and replace the entire stack.
So I don't think you rip and replace really ever in this day and age. Fortunately,
right?
Pretty difficult. 20, 30 years, right? We still have mainframes kicking around with RACF.
Probably many more years. Yeah,
exactly. So there's no such thing as rip and replace, for any modern enterprise. And when I say modern enterprise, I mean somebody that's generated a profit and been around for longer than, let's say, 5 to 7 years.
So not DoD. No, just kidding.
Right.
I don't see the profit yet for the warfighter. I need to see the return on investment for the taxpayer and the warfighter. Anyway,
well, that's exactly right. We want to see the value coming back on what we're spending and giving to the government. But kind of getting back into that prior question, so there is no rip and replace, right? There is kind of this, and I hate to use the Microsoft language of embrace and extend, meaning I want to keep your data store. Okta's doing a great job managing users. You like the self-service capabilities there. That's fine, right? But maybe I don't want to use them for authentication, and I definitely can't use them capability-wise for short-lived tokens or for rich authorization beyond that front door authentication process. So you have to be able to take that data, and again, this goes to the decoupling thought process. Right now, I've got these big giant Java apps, and whether it's Keycloak or some of the other major vendors in the space, Ping, ForgeRock. They've been around for 25 years. The code's 25 years old. They don't scale very well, and they've munged everything together because that was the pattern, right? That was accepted at the time. And so as I break out maybe my OAuth service, and I break out my authentication service, and I break out my user management service, I can select different SaaS applications, right? Or even different open source or different products that I, commercial products that I want to install within, my enterprise to actually start to take care of those. So I can get best of breed again. And that's because we're starting to use APIs to drive everything. It's one of the great benefits, as well as, potentially a downfall of APIs, but we'll talk about that probably a little later in this conversation.
Yeah. And so question, when it comes to the device piece, right? We talked a little bit about, I think it's so important for Zero Trust, right? To have a device identity, assign keys to each device, both for personal devices and for enterprise managed devices, both on mobile, desktop, laptops, right? Who do you think is leading when it comes to kind of doing, what we call in DoD, I guess, comply to connect or device enforcement, whatever you want to call it, beyond just the basic proxy stuff, right? How do you enforce device state? Looking at your patching state, do you have an endpoint protection stack installed? Anything you want to take a look at on the device. I know what we used in the department in terms of product, but I wanted to know what you think, which company are kind of leading on the device side.
Well, that's a tough one, right? Because there's some SaaS companies as well as, on device companies, and there's been a lot of acquisitions and mergers in that space. And I don't really want to point at one in particular because it would definitely show some favoritism, but what I would be looking for if I was out looking for a device vendor manufacturer, or for a device vendor protection platform, which is one, the catalog of the device, right? So it started off with device fingerprints, pretty simple to do, right? You're just looking at the HTTP request, what's coming over the wire. But it gives you some things, you see resolution change, you see, font supported change. You can start to make some type of intelligent decisions, but that doesn't do anything for, I jailbroke my device, or our device has been compromised in some manner, right? So then you need an actual on-system protection, right? So you need an SDK that can talk to hopefully both the secure enclave within the device, meaning store their private keys there, as well as also look at when that secure enclave is being accessed. And so at that point, now you can start saying, okay, well, what else is out there? Are they mirroring my app? Are they doing, do they clone my phone? Have they done different things to ensure that you no longer have the same level of vulnerability on that device as you may if it's just, kind of random Joe in a BYOD device scenario.
Right. Do you think it's a must to have a client effectively? I mean, for me, I always felt, without a client on the device, it's impossible to get to the full breadth of what you described. Is that a fair statement?
That's 100% fair, right? Because you can't trust a device. That's for sure. Whether I've just picked it up at Costco or whether I've had it for the last 20 years. As soon as that hits the network, that device has a very high likelihood of being at least attacked, if not compromised. Right. So it's kind of like that old DoD saying, right? If it's not air gapped, it's probably going to be compromised.
Although even if it's air gap, you never know. But because air gap is air gap, right? So looking at, I guess, your company, right? Do you provide device enforcement stuff, or that's something that you partner with others?
That's something we partner with others. So we can do very simple things, device profiling, which, it's essentially free at this point. It's very commoditized to make sure that nothing changed in that device from the first time we saw the token. But, for any of the...
Is that fair to say that's pretty easy to obfuscate or to at least... fake if it's not a client? Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, I personally wouldn't trust it for my security realm. It's a nice kind of also have. But it's definitely not something you're going to base.
Makes me feel better a little bit, but not really. Yeah.
I don't even think I'd say that. Maybe
people feel better about it.
Right. I think it's more like, okay, that's a nice, there's a value there, right? It's a signal. But as we all know, like cyber is about signals, right? And how many signals can I get? How well do those signals match? What can I do with that SIGINT? And then how can I parlay that into an actual decision?
So did you end up integrating with several companies, or you just pick one or two, or what's the vision there?
So what we've done is, we've created a very rich data access layer. We call it the identity hub. And that identity hub can go out to
that. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So we just pull data from whatever you have in place. Again, going back to, it's not a rip and replace. It's what can I do with what I have to make the best possible intelligence decisions for what's going on.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. So sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, please.
So we have pre-built integrations with things like RSA, with pieces coming out of Okta, with what was coming out of Cylance and CrowdStrike. So we can take that information and build risk profiles based off of it as part of the authorization decision.
Interesting. So I know the next big pillar, right? Moving to like modern ICAM is ready authorization, and first, most people don't actually understand, I believe, the difference, right, between authentication and authorization. Can you explain, like, in 2 words for Mister Everybody, like, what's the difference between the two?
Authorization is what happens after authentication. That's as simple as you can think about it. Whenever I go beyond, I authenticated to my device, right? First thing I access, whether it's the client service on my device, or whether it's browsing to Salesforce, I have to get authorization, right, to enter there.
So if people say, well, do you think, and I know the answer, but I'm just asking, on purpose, but for multi-factor authentication, MFA as a process, that's part of authentication, not authorization, right?
Correct.
So it's really post that MFA process and the whole shebang that, authorization is now going to define, effectively it's an enforcement point that's going to define what you get access to. And is it kind of, do you decouple the kind of policy code that defines what you get access to and the enforcer side?
Well, let's take one step back first, right? Because once I authenticate, right, and I just picked up my phone, I authenticate in, whether it's Face ID or otherwise. Now, my first authorization is, can I actually connect, right? It's a layer 4 essentially. Can I actually connect up to other services, right? And then it starts to build on that up through the different OSI model layers, right? Or I'm sorry, different TCP layers. And it ranges all the way from, can I actually access this service, or can this service talk to another service, all the way up to, what did I as a user consent to sharing with this service that can be shared with third-party services. And again, this goes back to, the Okta issue, right? It's third-party service out there without tight authorization controls. Well, once they get in, it's almost free reign. All that lateral movement is available to them. They can go from service to service to service, or in this case, organization to organization to organization, right? Pull that data back, set up additional admin accounts, things of that nature, to consume and to create long-lived breach potentials.
So, I had a question. Of course, you mentioned the fact that, hey, if you store data somewhere and you keep the private keys, at least you're securing your data. But if you also use a SaaS service to do the enforcement and the control plane of identity management, effectively, that software that's going to say, yes, you can access this, or no, you cannot access this, if that software is tempered, right, and someone managed to effectively change the way it's going to allow access to things, despite not having access to the data, you could still get in trouble because that control plane is owned, and effectively the process of authentication and authorization could be in some way bypassed, right?
Yeah, in some ways it can be munged together, right? But again, if you think about authorization is defining the who, what, where, why, when, right? And pulling as many signals together as possible. Not all of those signals are going to come directly from that IDP, right? They're not all going to come from the Okta paying for drugs of the world, right? They're going to come from local entitlement databases, Akamai, right? Your device management software, and all of that needs to come together, right, to have the successful authorization decisions as you access different services, different accounts, different capabilities within the DoD or within your organization.
But a lot of these companies are starting to sell the decision points as part of their packages, right? They want to sell you the whole shebang. So would you be cautious hosting kind of the decision point things, whatever you want to call that, on a multi-tenant shared SaaS service? Because if that's compromised, that's a big deal, right?
It's a huge deal, right? And so my personal opinion is that that's extraordinarily scary. And to help obviate that concern, right, what do I need to do? Well, I need to start to move both the policy decision points as well as the policy enforcement points into my local infrastructure. But I need to do this anyways, right? Because as I think about how applications are being built today, right, they're being assembled. They're now no longer being kind of just hard coded. I'm stacking APIs from different vendors and trying to push all these things together into an application. What's happening with each of those is I'm making external or internal calls, right, to access different data points. And I want to authorize each and every one of those to make sure I don't have the wrong data and to make sure I'm not sharing the wrong data. So where does that need to live? If I have that in a centralized cloud service, what happens? Well, my distributed service is making a call each and every time to get the freshest data that it can. Extraordinarily expensive, extraordinarily slow. So what I need to do is start to have those policy decision and policy enforcement points co-located with my services. There's some great patterns within Istio and Kubernetes, the sidecar model. And there's also great ways and great scalability in being able to push out these different policies down to my distributed services. So I can now take those services and I can also push them anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because it's no longer about, I've got a centralized infrastructure. It's that I want to be multi-cloud. And as I think about edge, I want to actually
be disconnected, intermittent. Yep.
Exactly. I mean, in the battlefield, right, I've got millions of edge devices. So I want to push that data all the way out, or push that authorization decision criteria all the way out to that edge device, and then see real-time tokens being minted about what data can be accessed, how can it be shared, let's make sure that it's not compromised, et cetera, et cetera.
So that effectively means that all the way we also architect those components of the control plane of the identity management enforcement stack, that is a piece that also should be treated as cattle, meaning, kill it, go back to immutable state. So if a malicious actor, right, got access to some of this stuff, that goes back, to 0 every 4 hours, whatever. So like the notion of hosting this potentially as a short-lived, container and just enforcing that moving target defense, that's a pretty good principle, right, for this stuff.
Exactly. And fundamentally, right, well, that's what we're doing under the covers, right? I see a new service get instantiated in any of your major service meshes, Kubernetes, et cetera, or functions, FAS platforms, right? I see that service. Do I recognize that service? Yes or no? If I recognize it, let me push policies that are relevant to that service down to it. If I don't recognize that service, let me at least give it a baseline level of policies. And let's also inspect and make sure that it's a service we should be talking to. Does it have the appropriate X509 cert from, Spiffy, Spire, or other other X509 based providers?
Yeah. Do you guys did some work with Spiffy and Spire with your company?
I've been fortunate enough to be working in that working group for the past couple of years. I've been less active lately, but it's a great technology. Hands off to the team that have been working on it. They're now mostly at HP, but
yes, I saw that.
Sunil will be successful there as well. And so, yes, we've been working with it. We actually look at Spiffy Spire as being part of the underlying infrastructure, right? As I see new services spin up, they need an identity. They absolutely must have one, particularly in more sensitive environments. What's the best way to give them one? Well, service provider identity for everything, Spiffy. And so how can we take that then and take that Spiffy identity and actually parlay that into what we think of as an OAuth client identity, even for backend services. Now use that as that common federation protocol, right? So I can go across namespaces, so I can go across clouds. So I'm no longer limited to my very narrow, service mesh or Kubernetes namespace, or even to Kubernetes and service meshes. But I can start to carry that Spiffy ID coupled with an OAuth client ID out to every service everywhere.
Yeah, that's huge. And a lot of people ask on Twitter, so I can bring it up on the screen, but they ask, hey, and that's my opinion, that we're moving away from OAuth more to OpenID and all that kind of stuff. Is that a fair statement to say if companies were to start implementing stuff today, they should look into OpenID more so than OAuth, or what's winning, I guess?
Yeah, OIDC and OAuth are the fundamental protocols for your modern IAM platform.
And if you have to pick between the two, which one wins today?
I don't think they're
OIDC and OAuth.
There's not any real competition for them, right? OIDC is like, how do they authenticate, and at least my profile data coming down in what we think of as an identity token. OAuth takes over from there for distributed delegated authorization.
I see.
And then OAuth has been actually doing lots and lots of works in the standards bodies, bringing things like rich authorization requests forward, or even an OAuth grant spec. So I can start to do fine-grained authorization, right, at my OAuth service, as opposed to even trying to embed it or hard-code it into my app.
I see. So you decouple that too.
Correct.
Interesting. All right. So let's go to the next piece of the meat. Right. Obviously, we talked a little bit about the Okta breach, I believe there is a lot of lessons learned, including on how not to manage a breach for a company. But what are your I guess lessons learned, and what do you see your customers learning from that breach?
Well, there's a lot of lessons learned, right? There's a myriad of them. I mean, fundamentally, I think there's a couple key ones, right? First, you hit on communication. The second one is, excuse me, the second one is third-party access. In particular, who am I trusting with with access into my platform, particularly with elevated privileges?
Yeah, don't read the stuff. I'm just putting stuff on the screen.
Yeah, it's okay. No problem.
Yeah. I know it's distracting.
Yeah. Who am I trusting, right? So all of the third parties, and whether they're third parties platforms, like Okta that were call center style platforms, or whether those are third party SaaS companies, right? That I'm actually communicating, saying, hey, I'm just going to deliver text messages over Twilio, right? I am sharing sensitive data with them each and every time. And one of the big things that we've seen is that companies have no idea what APIs they have, right? And I'm not sure if this is true in the DoD. I'm going to presume not, but but the CISO has no idea what the developers are doing, and oftentimes the developers, once they finish a product, they don't remember necessarily what they are doing. So there's all of these APIs that are picking out there that might be rogue, that might be shadow, that might be totally compliant, but they're not appropriately itemized, cataloged, and protected. And that's a big thing.
So API discovery and kind of asset management stuff, right?
Correct. Right. So that's a big part, because I'm sharing sensitive data all the time via APIs, right? If we look at the statistics, what is it? 88% of internet traffic now is machine to machine. And that's an API, that's a service to service call that should be using OAuth and bringing that data, or using OAuth to both authenticate and authorize what data is flowing across that transaction.
Right.
So that would be the second big thing. The third big thing, is going to be, how do I mitigate what just happened? And this is where I think it goes back to the first one, which is the communication aspect. How do I actually communicate effectively with what's going on? If we look at the Okta breach, right, I think they were notified by their third-party provider in January 20th timeframe of a potential breach.
Yeah, that was a long time, for maybe 2 months.
It was a big lag, right? 60 days or so over what occurred, and then when did the research start, and how did we actually get into and find out what may or may not have happened.
And it even seems the research was pretty basic, and they didn't realize kind of how bad it was, in my opinion. But maybe I'm wrong. All they just lied. Either way, I don't know.
Yeah, based on what I saw from the leaked mandate report, I am definitely in your camp on that one. Because I think there was some very simple things, right? Like downloading things from GitHub, downloading hacker tools from GitHub, that are designed to compromise from the compromised machines, right? So some things that kind of should have surfaced, should have been accessed, should have been noted by different security personnel, and ensured that exactly what was happening, and does it warrant further inspection. And I think that was missed on both the third-party provider, but that bubbles up, right? Because you're taking, as Okta's taking responsibility by using that third-party provider, the onus ends up falling on them. Yeah,
I mean, ultimately, it's their product, right? They can hide behind third parties as much as they want, but that doesn't play. I don't think anyone cares. In fact, most people don't even know the name of the provider, right? So they hide it. I mean, people think of Okta as a breach, not the third-party provider. So, and then of course the management of the the press and kind of the notification of the customer wasn't great.
Agreed.
A lot of people didn't even know if they were part of the 2.5% customers impacted or not for a long time, and people even debate whether the 2.5% was just like a test from the hackers to see what they could do. But if they don't have a kind of a super admin account anyway, which effectively means they could have, effectively hacked every customer, which, when you go and say, oh, don't worry, only 2.5% of the customers were impacted, that sounds pretty good, right? I mean, that sounds like, oh, whatever, right? But the question is, were they only impacted because the hacker didn't want to impact them, and he could have? That's a whole different story, right? And that's kind of the issue with multi-tenants, right?
Well, I look at it like 2.5% of 10,000 plus customers. That's still a
that's
big
a lot
number,
of customers,
right?
of course. Yeah.
And what happens once those, if they are indeed breached, right? Now those people have to look at, hey, we're third-party service providers to however many other customers that could or could not be Okta customers. So it
because
really,
they could be federated and using, and then you have, what if the 2.5% is some of the duty customers, right?
Yep. Oh, agreed, right? And I think that's really where the interconnectedness, right? And whether we talk about it as APIs or we talk about it as federation, really becomes so imperative, right? At being able to quickly notify as well as quickly stop exactly what's transpiring. Again, moving into things like very short-lived tokens. And if you start to see these cyber signals like, hey, this guy just made a request from this compromised or potentially compromised machine out to GitHub for hacking tools, well, maybe we should shut down that machine, right? No more RDPs, no more transactions coming in from it. And that's an authorization problem.
But if we're moving to the new paradigm of sidecar containers and all the stuff we talked about in terms of ability to decouple and scale and have better cyber principles and all this good stuff, why do we still need to use a SaaS service? Why wouldn't you just go all in and just host the control plane on some cluster on multiple cloud? If people are going to run Kubernetes all over the place anyways, which is pretty much what's happening, right? In fact, a lot of banks and healthcare companies are moving away from hosted, paths to their own clusters on the cloud. I'm not saying don't use the cloud, right? But
right.
It's just often multi-cloud. So now you have multiple regions, multiple clouds. Kubernetes acts as an abstraction layer, so you can effectively have more resiliency, self-healing, auto-scaling across nodes and clouds. The application doesn't have to know it's running on Amazon Azure and Google and whatever, right? So why wouldn't people just go all in and take products that can be deployed on Kubernetes anywhere and not have to deal with the multi-tenant risk? Why would you take such a risk? I mean, I get the convenience for smaller companies and maybe a bakery or whatever, right? But for healthcare, finance, DoD, why would someone be okay giving the keys to the crown jewels?
Fundamentally, it's about efficiency, right?
Yeah.
Your developers may or may not know OIDC and OAuth, right? In fact, I think we see, major.
But what if they still pay? What if they still pay a company and the company brings it on your premises, right? I'm not saying like build your own stuff.
Okay, got it.
But don't host it as a multi-tenant, right? So bring it, pay the support, right? I'm not saying like, waste your time building the stuff. No way, right? But why wouldn't everybody push that on-prem? I see so many companies still not support. In fact, on-prem, you see Atlassian, right? We'll talk a little bit about Atlassian today, but Atlassian pushing people to move off of their on-prem stuff and go to the SaaS, and then the SaaS has an issue, and you have dozens of customers without the Atlassian suite for 2 weeks because they can't fix it fast enough, and now you're trusting them to run their own product, and apparently they don't even know how to do that. So how, why would we not have the support on our stuff?
Patching is a big one, right? This is one of the reasons we've kind of moved into that SaaS, right?
Convenience. But if everything is cattle and self-update, self-heal, right? Within that, I mean, GitOps, if the company is not 20 years behind and with 20 years of tech debt, and they have the modern, containerized microservices, all that stuff, right? Why wouldn't we just do that, right?
I agree with you, but you'll have to point me to the company, that again, that's older than 10 years old, right? That is all entirely on Kubernetes, because I don't find them very often. Maybe Netflix, companies that have been very modern from their inception and have really been.
But even if you're not entirely on Kubernetes, you could host the ICAM stack on Kubernetes, and then normal apps, right, could access that as a service.
Agreed. You absolutely could.
I mean, your entire stack has to be containerized, right?
But we're also moving now back into like that appliance model, right? That was super popular in the mid 2000s. And in fact, I'm seeing it happen a lot in the security industry, where we're going to give you a container, just run this in Kubernetes. And, from what I have seen, there's not tons of expertise of Kubernetes, right, in the industry. Yes, there are, there's 1% or whatever the number is, people that kind of understand it and can make it work. But everybody's using managed Kubernetes because they just can't find the in-house expertise, and the training hasn't been done.
So it's a talent issue, I guess.
Yep. So could it happen? Yes. Will it happen? Probably. Is it happening now? Not really.
Of talent.
Right. And the other thing is once I'm giving you all this software to run in Kubernetes, that software can have its own issue, needs its own patching, et cetera, right? Right. So I'm kind of back to the same problem. And I actually really worry when I see people saying, hey, I'm just getting essentially a container or an appliance, right, that I'm going to run in my Kubernetes namespace, and it needs access to all my central services. And it's like, okay, I mean, I get it, but I have a different risk vector. I'm just kind of moving this risk problem around.
Right. I mean, the managed source code stuff and the update process is a problem regardless where you put it, right? Whether it's a SaaS. On the SaaS, I would argue you have less visibility, though, because you completely trust. In fact, my bet is that Atlassian is pushing for the SaaS version because the CVs are so bad that they are tired of delivering containers on-prem because people freak out. I remember as a CSO, I was in very heated conversation with Atlassian with the number of 1,400 CVEs on Jira and Confluence alone. And their take was, oh, it's just, mitigated in ways that we couldn't even validate because we don't have access to the source code. But, and how convenient it is now to push a SaaS service of Atlassian, because guess what? You have zero visibility on the CVEs of that software. You run a service. You have no clue what's the state of their cybersecurity. You trust their SaaS pretty much as a customer. Versus if you host it, you're going to do some due diligence. You can also have some additional cyber capability that could mitigate some of the risk you're taking by hosting these containers. You could mitigate the lateral movement, right, using zero trust. You could potentially have behavior detection, looking at exfiltration of data, right, continuous monitoring with prevention capabilities like the twist lock of the world, right? So you could have a lot of different things to kind of at least be alerted. But if you're on a SaaS, look at the customers, right, of Okta. 2 months later, they didn't know what was going on. If you have a decent cyber posture, at the very least, you could have at least be aware much sooner than that, right? So you're giving away a lot of trust to these companies when you host that kind of crown jewel, both for the zero trust enforcement side, the identity management side, the GitOps, hosting your source code repo to a multi-tenant tech stack is a big risk. The GitHub and GitLab of the world on the .com, hosted SaaS side, it's pretty scary. If that get hacked, good luck, right?
Right. Yeah. Crown jewels are gone right away, right? Everybody knows where things are. And there's not even very good security through obscurity, right? So it's
and if you're small companies, you become targeted because of the bigger guys, right? So now you inherit additional risks that you would not have, at least maybe not the same kind of threat actors going after your services, right? With the same amount of energy and time and investment, right?
And you stop things at either Kubernetes ingress controller or potentially a firewall that comes in beforehand, right? That may or may not be what your SaaS company has deployed. And I think this goes back, and to be the contrary in the conversation, I'll just argue the opposite side.
Yeah,
I'm more in agreement than I'm not. If I look at point 2 on the Okta breach, right? It's how do you trust your third parties, right? And whether it's Okta doing identity management, or as you're pointing out, whether it's me pushing up sales opportunities into Salesforce, sending text messages through Twilio, right? We're assembling these applications. So how do I start to know exactly how data is moving, have appropriate authentication, authorization, and audit for each of those different subroutines that are running in my assembled application? And Okta, easy to pick at, right? Because it happened recently, and there's definitely some crown jewels there, but you're leaking sensitive data, each and every time you're making these API calls. We've had customers say, hey, not only do we know what APIs we have, we don't know what's in those APIs. And even when we go out and query other people's APIs, we get data that comes back that we don't own, right? Meaning, hey, we're supposed to get your first name, last name, and you gave us all of your account data, right? Because their APIs aren't doing a good job. And once it hits my service, well, what am my developer do with it? Well, they might dump it to syslog, or they might put it over into the SIM, or they might even communicate it to another service. And that's one of the reasons, right, that authorization really becomes this critical construct in this cloud native world, because I'm not going to be able to stop these integrations, right? My developer is going to do what's fastest, what's easiest, what gets the job done. And the chaos always comes before the organization, right? So we're still in this chaos phase where we're building things as quickly as possible. Now, how do I make sure that I'm not creating liabilities for myself? How do I authorize both the data going out from my services, as well as authorizing the data that my service queried for coming into my service? And that's authorization from, are the right data elements there? Are the right cyber signals there for allowing the transaction? Did the user authenticate properly before performing this transaction through a service? All the way down to, did that user consent to sharing that data with these different services? And again,
how much of that is like manual, policy stuff, or like signatures or settings versus behavior AI driven?
I missed the first part of your question. I'm sorry.
How much of that is more manual policy S code and kind of settings and whitelisting, manual whitelisting and things like that, versus like automated, AI driven behavior detection stuff that will allow the traffic to flow?
So good question. So finding your APIs, profiling your APIs, as well as the queries, right? Mostly automated.
Yeah.
Creating policies, that's going to typically get stemmed out. Well, you have a couple different types of policies. Let me take one step back, right? So I might have GDPR, CCPA, NIST, AAL level policies, right? That are kind of my fundamental baseline that I know I want everybody in my organization or every developer in my organization to adhere to. Now, as I get further down into that, maybe I, as a company, am hosting a SaaS, a multi-tenant SaaS, right? And I'm sharing data out to different customers. Now I need to get very explicit, right? When I'm acting as this user, as an admin in this org, what are the entitlements that I may or may not have? And that's really where things get critical and get very complicated. That's much more of a static, policy setting, because it's tough to discover, discern, understand. Whereas some of the broader pieces, what do my baseline policies look like? Where are my APIs? What kind of data do they have? Something that can be automated. Now, what can also be automated is the net results from all of that, right? As I look at all of these different transactions, are things going bad? Are they going well? Somebody doing, business DDoS attacks? Are they trying to parlay different information into my access points? And then how do I actually adjust my policies on behalf of that? So am I seeing things happen that look potentially nefarious? How do I respond, react, et cetera?
Yeah, very cool. I guess, all this is showing kind of a different level of maturity between companies implementing all these tools, right? If you look at the potential of the tools today to do this kind of stuff, and you look at the actual implementation from the customers, how many customers are even remotely close to doing something that advanced versus just barely struggling with the ABC of security, of identity management?
So most customers aren't actually that advanced, right? And again, going back to my earlier statement, right? What we found is that the vast majority of companies don't know what APIs they have, right? Yeah. So as we go back to that, the question is, how do I take that data? How do I actually get my arms around, the visibility aspect? I'm sorry, I've got an attendee who's homesick from school.
Say hi. Cute kid.
Thank you. He's at home with a stomach ache today.
No, that's not fun.
So to your, I just lost your question. I'm sorry.
No. I guess I lost the question too. But we were talking about the maturity of the customers.
Yeah. Most companies can't get their arms around their APIs, right? Even north-south, much less east-west. Yeah. So being able to bring in a rich catalog of what data is out there. What APIs are out there, north-south and east-west, and then what data are those different APIs sharing, right? That becomes like that critical first step. From there, you can start building the authorization policies and starting to build that feedback loop on, what do the audit logs look like, for the results of these different authorizations.
Yeah, very cool. You're making a use case for one of the company I'm on the board of, traceable AI. The whole thing is the API discovery stuff. And I did not ask you to do that. So this is I guess it was a good.
Well, it's an important part, right? Just because there's nothing happening, or there's not a lot happening there, and it's a huge fundamental problem.
And it's like it's going back to what you don't know and what you know. So how do you protect something you don't know? Is kind of the ABC of cyber, right?
Exactly.
So we talked a little bit about the differences between NP and PE, right? The people versus systems. What do you say what would you say in terms of implementation of the implementation of identity management? What is different between people versus what of course, with people we worry about the device they're using and things like that. What is different when you think of security and ICAM and authorization and all that kind of stuff between people and systems?
Oh, I mean, they're just fundamental differences on how you authenticate, right? If we think about two-factor as something you have, something you know, right, or MFA, something you have, something you know, and even something you are, right? And I take them to kind of break those down and cross across the PE versus the NPE, right? Yep. It's really easy to understand how that fits into the PE world, right? Okay, I'm Nathan. I have a password, and my heart beats in this pattern, right, for biometrics authentication. When I start to say, well, how do I apply those same kind of precepts to NPEs, and whether that's an IoT NPE, whether it's a function, whether it's a Kubernetes service, right? Yep. I need to do the same thing because I need to authenticate and authorize and make sure that my developers aren't putting something that may or may not be nefarious out there, or even accidentally nefarious. So how do I actually start to say, okay, the code checked in was good, right? Because it needs to start all the way at the very beginning. The access patterns coming from that code out to different platforms, third-party providers is good. I'm actually allowed to spin up this code in this relevant namespace, right, or on this pod. And then I'm going to authorize access to this service, right, that I'm spinning up on the right pod with the right checked-in code, et cetera, and kind of follow that entire supply chain of exactly what needs to transpire to spin this service, this pod up. And so saying, okay, I can have something I know, like, do I recognize it? Did this user have access to Kubernetes to actually spin this up? But then, is it the right, is there a secret there, right? And I think this is where Spiffy is designed to kind of come forward. I've got an X509 v3 cert. Great, let's continue to move that forward. And then the third piece, right, the biometrics, right, is this: what happened to the supply chain? Was there a signature, when the user checked it in, or when the developer, checked it in? How do I parlay that all the way up into that service is now allowed to spin up? And then how do I control who's allowed to access that service as an admin versus what other machines are allowed to access that service on behalf of additional users?
Yeah. How much do you train your kind of educate your kids on all that kind of stuff? Are you already I'm trying, of course, my kids are under 3, so it's a little bit harder, but are you spending some time trying to educate your kids in IT?
Actually, my kids are pretty young, and I try to keep them off screen in general. So, I've got 8 and a 3-year-old, and being able to control what they look like, authorize them, when they're allowed to watch TV versus not watch TV, is really important. I think a lot of IT really comes from how are you thinking, right? Meaning going back to the old developer question, right, that we all learned in comp sci. What are the steps for making a peanut butter jelly sandwich? So being able to understand, like, how does the world work and how can you put these different things together? When do I open the jar? When do I pull the knife out? And how do I spread it on my bread? Really becomes a fundamental part of education for kids.
Yeah, no doubt. All right, we have one more question from me before we go to the public question. So, we talked, you and I, before about OpenPolicy and OPA, right? Which is also part of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Tell us a little bit about what is OPA. Most people don't really know why it matters and what it is.
So OPA is a pretty cool open source project, right? That was part of the CNCF and went from incubator to I forgot the next step. It's totally slipping my mind right now.
I'll find out, but keep talking.
I'm sorry. And it's really about having distributed enforcement points and then having a net new policy language. And that net new policy language is called REGO. REGO
graduated, I think. I think it's graduated.
Yes.
Graduated. Yeah.
Thank you. That policy language is called REGO. REGO is like a programming language. It's almost like JavaScript, although it's not, in my opinion, it's not quite.
It's a painful one. It's a painful one. Okay. Let's just.
I didn't want to dive too deep into that. There's a lot of companies out there working hard to give education on REGO.
Yes. And building UI and trying to make it a little bit easier, right?
Correct. And I mean, OPA is very powerful. You know, we use OPA and support OPA fully, as well as support other policy languages, in particular JavaScript and JSON object policies. But
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's becoming a widely adopted, you know, pseudo standard because it's an open source tool, and I don't think there's been a formal standards body wrapped around it yet.
Yeah.
But all of that kind of works together to create a distributed way of doing declarative authorization policies and having distributed policy enforcement points that are now pushed out to the edge of your services.
And does it really scale? You know, some people were concerned about the Rego stuff and the OPA stuff, and were saying, hey, you know, maybe that works for 10,000 policies, but if you have 4 million users, good luck with that. Is that true? Is that not true? True.
So it kind of depends on what you're doing with it, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things that OPA does well, right, is scaling for policy enforcement. And I want to be very clear when I use the language. But scaling for policy decision is a little bit different because I need to have the appropriate data there, right, to scale for that policy decision.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, you know, if I'm doing that at the edge of my service and I'm doing it from multiple services that are all serving up, you know, my web server or, you know, my functions, that gets very expensive because I'm making these queries from Rego up to those different data sources. And yes, while the data is fresh, that's great. But being able to go and query from every independent microservice or IoT device or whatever I'm using, protecting with my open agent, right, extraordinarily expensive. So it's OPA that's, you know, when it's coupled with things like OAuth, and more specifically OAuth RAR, where I'm controlling what data is actually coming down to OPA, and then OPA is allowed to use Rego-based policies, right, to govern access control down to the underlying functions within your service, so that they can work hand in hand, absolutely. And I think it builds a very good model for companies building, you know, their next generation of services.
Yeah, very cool. All right. So for people that don't know, they should take a look at what OPA is and does. And there's a lot of training online now, so a little bit easier than it was 2 years ago. So we got a few questions from the public here, so we'll take that now. So Cameron was asking, what's the best practice approach to combine credential sources into the identity so that the session level authorization is fully informed that the policy determine PDP, whatever policy
Policy
decision point to allow or deny access.
So, you know, the best data is the freshest data, right? That's a simple way of thinking about it. However, you know, as we know, lots of times, you know, Active Directory, data stores, et cetera, won't scale enough, right, to query at the millions or tens of thousands of transactions per second, or even hundreds of thousands of transactions per second. So being able to aggregate that, you know, at a front door in the same way we used to do authentication really becomes a critical part of the overall usage pattern. And what that means. And so what that means, right, is actually being able to aggregate, right, as the first time we see that access token or that item, say that OIDC token, be able to go out and say, I need additional data from X, Y, and Z, and then map that into both the access patterns. Again, following the open banking pieces, I'm going to go to the transfer account and I want to authorize transfer of, you know, $10,000. Well, now I want to actually go and refresh that data for the most sensitive transactions I have and bring those back and make my authorization decisions at the edge of the service.
That makes sense. So fresh data, and so you have no choice but to somewhat cache it, or at least bring it to some other capacity because of the limitation of the IDP, right? So that's just part of the puzzle.
Well, and the reality is most of your data won't come from the IDP, right? The IDP has, you know, your user profile data, things of that nature. Important, don't get me wrong. In fact, critical, right? Particularly as we think about how are we authenticating users. And they also bring things like, you know, an ACR record. How did that user authenticate? And so they're able to bring that bit of detail, but then you also need to augment that, right? Because I want the cyber signaling. I want to know, hey, did this user actually perform a SQL injection attack, right? Or something else nefarious that's coming from Akamai or coming from, you know, Imperva. And then I want to know the device data, right? How much do we trust this device, right? Do they have a local client, right, that's looking for jailbreaking, et cetera, et cetera? And then is there an existing entitlement store, right, this application is already leveraging? Well, I want to bring that data back as well. And I want to do this at very, very high speeds because I want to do individual tokens for individual transactions. And that's one of the things that we focused on right from the get-go is like, how can we start to take OAuth, which can scale massively. However, because of the way it's been integrated right into some of the legacy IDPs out there, it doesn't scale massively, or it isn't scaling massively. So, we were fortunate enough to sign our first customer, and they wanted to do scale up to 1 billion and to 1.2 billion NPEs and PEs. And they needed to do hundreds of thousands of transactions per second. And so we said, hey, you know what, we got to start this in a different manner. We want to bring in, excuse me, we want to rewrite everything using Golang, right? Something that's designed for containers. We want to decouple. So let's just use the different identity sources that are out there, bring that data to fruition, right? And then start to use that as well as rich governance and rich authorization policies around what's in the token, right? So every token mint can be authorized as well as the data that's in that token mint. And then when that token mint's evaluated at the end of the service using things like OPA, right? To make sure that data is used, the data in the token and the access token is being used appropriately by the service.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. All right, let's see the next question. Well, people care about, of course, security and FIPS compliance 140-2. How do you ensure compliance when you deploy your stack with the FIPS 140-2?
Well, I believe the world's, aren't we on 140.3-3 now? It has the world's, and that's really about key storage, right? As well as encryption types. So being able to use, the appropriate key storage, and whether that is cloud key stores or on-prem key stores, this goes back to one of our earlier points in the conversation of, what if in a multi-tenant SaaS storage, I was able to control access to the keys? Now I can start to fundamentally change the discussion because I can control the keys. I hear that something happened, breach, whatever it might be, by one of your third parties. Now I'm going to restrict access to those keys for unlocking the data that's up in the cloud. And I think that's a big part of being able to ensure that your PEs are safe. You can do the same thing for NPEs, right? As we think about Spiffy in particular, right? When is it allowed to check out keys, or when is it allowed to go and create net new X509 certs? Oh, I think I have a breach of some sort between my different services. Let me, one, publish a CRL for the certificates down to those breach services. But two, maybe I'm going to start restricting access of exactly what's allowed to transpire. I want much better insight into in every one of the individual transactions for a net new certificate.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very cool. And I guess Ryan was sharing how Rancher was doing their FIPS compliance. All right. So next question you got was on a specific product. So you don't have to answer the product per se, I guess, but if you want to answer the type of product, if you want, what are your thoughts on Cloudflare for Zero Trust?
So I don't have an opinion on individual products that I'm willing to share on the podcast. But I, Zero Trust is a giant spectrum. In fact, almost everything in security now is Zero Trust. Chase Cunningham is doing this
pretty bloated, right?
Yeah, on mapping out what Zero Trust means from SIM providers down to user authentication providers. And I would say my thoughts on Zero Trust, let's go back to what is Zero Trust. The user, the device, the service, the client service all need to authenticate each other and then authorize every individual data element going over the wire.
Right. And that's the thing, right? For me, the people use the term Zero Trust just using a proxy and forgetting about the device, forgetting about the data labeling, forgetting about the microsegmentation, whitelisting stuff. Cloudflare is a great product, but I think it's not a Zero Trust stack. That's not an end-to-end Zero Trust capability. It checks a few boxes, but I would argue many of the most important ones are not checked if you don't have additional products on top. So that's my take on that.
I would agree, right? It's going to be a symbiotic platform, and it's got to be an entire ecosystem because Zero Trust for supply chain looks very different than Zero Trust for an end user, which looks very different than Zero Trust for an API. And so
I think if you look at the biggest bang for the buck, and I'm going to do a video on Zero Trust, but I mean, for me, at the end of the day, there are three main companies kind of bringing a lot of the pieces of Zero Trust, as a turnkey thing, bringing the device enforcement, the strong user authentication, and the data labeling and kind of the mapping of that and microsegmentation, all that, whitelisting and policy enforcement point. It's really, Zscaler, AppGate, and kind of Google with Beyond Cope now has a different name, but kind of the three initial leaders. Then it's spreading, and everybody's trying to do their own things. Palo Alto and others, F5. But I think the device enforcement point, I think, is probably the most forgotten piece of the puzzle of zero trust. I how many times I've seen people not even think about device enforcement and just, oh, it's okay, we do strong identities. Who cares about the device? Well, even if the device is just accessing a website, that device could have malware to keylog, to take screenshots of what you're looking at. I mean, it's still a massive risk. Inject stuff in your session, reuse the keys. I mean, it's a massive risk to just ignore the device state.
Agreed, and exactly. And I think that's why it's so imperative to bring that data to fruition, right? And when I say fruition, I don't mean just storing it in your SIM, right? That's valuable, but you're kind of waiting till after the fact. There's no real-time remediation that can occur. But being able to have a device profiling service, right, that is doing a good job in real time, is sending out notifications, or being able to be queried, like, hey, how much do I trust my iPhone, Pro Max 13 that Nicholas is running? And so that has to lend in or jump into like the credibility of the transaction. It's not just did the user authenticate, to your point, but how much do I trust the device he's authenticating on? Does that mean he can be an admin, or does that just mean he can do something simple for a non-privileged transaction?
Yeah, very good. So we have two questions now, kind of unrelated to ICANN, but part of the kind of the same ecosystem. So I always take every question, anyways. But you don't have to answer them. But I'm gonna give a shot, and then if you want to add to that, feel free to do it. So I guess the first question was looking forward to the discussion on Atlassian, and what is your go-to recommendation as an alternative to Jira? So I guess I posted yesterday about the fact that Atlassian had an issue, a tech stack issue. I don't think it was cyber related, but more like an actual bug that led to many customers, not a lot, but enough to be painful, to lose access to their Atlassian suite for up to 2 weeks, which is a very long time. I don't know how you survive without 2 weeks planning. Yeah, it's just it's when you really use a suite for project management, you effectively told them like the entire sprint would be done without a tool, right? So that's pretty scary. And if you have tickets and all this stuff, and the more you use features and bells and whistles, the more painful it's going to be. Many of the other products integrate to Jira and create tickets and things that now wouldn't work. So it's a pretty, a mind-boggling issue. And, my take was always, I've been vocal about the number of CVEs of Jira and Confluence for a publicly traded company, kind of getting away with it for years, mostly because the fact is there's not a lot of competition. It's pretty surprising, that really no one is. I mean, look, you have GitLab, right, that has a lot of the features, but they know they're starting on the Git standpoint, the CI side. They're kind of trying to play catch up, on the product management side. They have some good stuff, tickets, issues, and all these things, and kind of Kanban boards and stuff. But it's a paid, pretty expensive feature. But it's also not fully ready. There's still a lot of work, and they're doing the work, right? But the fact is, there's not a lot of alternatives to Jira. There's a little bit of different tools you could use when it comes to chat ops and when it comes to Kanban boards and stuff, but it's not cohesive as a kind of the suite. I never really liked the Bitbucket, right? I think it's not great. So people would go to GitHub and GitLab, and now of course if you're looking at Jira and Confluence, well really. GitLab is probably the next best thing, right? Unfortunately, I guess today it's kind of there's not a lot of breadth of options. My fear is when companies like Atlassian are telling customers, you know what, we're going to stop our support of on-premise instantiation of Atlassian, and you're going to have to move to our SaaS, which now creates a massive cyber risk. Of course, it was already massive because you're hosting all these 1,400 CVEs on your stack, and you get visibility on the CVEs. If now they don't have to deliver the containers to you, you cannot scan them. You don't even know what kind of risk you're accepting, and you're going to use a SaaS version blindly and just accept the risk. But if on top of it, they can't even host it in a way that keeps the product up and running, where you don't have 2 weeks downtimes, I just don't know what to say to defend them. I mean, there's just nothing left, right? So I don't know if you want to add to it, but for me, the fact that the company is pushing people to the cloud, mostly because it's convenient, also allows them not to be transparent with the CVs and the product, but then they can't even like host it right themselves and support it in a way that doesn't have 2 weeks downtime for customers. Like, how is the world okay with it? I mean, I see the stock not even like moving that much. I mean, it's not doing great, but it's not. You would expect the stock market to be like, freaking out about this. I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Honestly, I don't. I don't understand, customer retention, right? When you see things like that, but the lack of a viable alternative, to your point, really.
It's probably the biggest reason, right? And then, people spend quite a bit of money on the yearly subscription. You can't just walk away and, I wonder what kind of compensation you get, when, they're going to give you a month free for losing 2 weeks of service, but it's just like the lack of the actual loss of performance and timeliness and, the cost to the teams that, for a large team, it could be millions, that's, I guess that's when you start realizing the importance of the tool, which I guess makes a point to, well, then they build a pretty good tool because it helps people save a bunch of time and money. Great, but it's not stable and it's not secure. And what was always driving me crazy was the discussions where we would spend more time arguing whether or not one of the 1,400 CVs was actually, mitigated and how it was mitigated. And at the same time, you could have patched the stuff for God's sake and not spend 2 weeks, 2 months arguing about whether or not you should have updated the bits or not. Just update the freaking bits, like trying to mitigate everything. Maybe there's a stopgap, but there was dependencies that were 12 years old. Like, how do you explain that as a cyber conscious? No one can justify this, and they kept trying to, and I was like, guys, just stop trying to justify something that just cannot be. Just update the freaking bits.
Yeah, but it's the tech debt, right? And it's the tech debt showcasing itself as a SaaS company. And I mean, I think this is actually a prime reason to go with kind of smaller, newer companies. There's reasons against that too, but if I look at what's out there, right, whether it's identity management or whether it's Atlassian, right, I'm looking at companies that have been around for decades, and they have the tech debt showcasing it. And how hard is it to update your code? It's super hard when you have tens of thousands of customers, because you can't just push something out. If it breaks, right, you have a whole different dunce cap, that you have to wear. So you have to be extra conservative on what you're doing. And like, how do you bridge those two different worlds together? Part of it might be I'm going to buy a new company, or I'm going to buy a competitor, right, and start to transition people there. Or it might be I'm going to build a secondary platform and do the same thing, which becomes itself extraordinarily hard, because you ask people to migrate. When your people are migrating, they're open to competition, and somebody comes and says, "Hey, don't migrate. Come buy my new product."
Right.
So it's
that's a big risk for them to do that, right?
Exactly. So
maybe they forgot about that one.
It's tough the whole way around.
Particularly when you told them you were going to sell this, and now you're saying, "Well, just kidding. We're not going to do this anymore." That's a pretty big blow, right? And I guess we should have also mentioned Azure DevOps. I kind of didn't think of it, but it's true. A lot of people moving from TFS to Azure DevOps. And, people criticize Microsoft, but the fact is, the fact that Microsoft was smart enough to let Azure DevOps run anywhere, that was a genius move. I was very impressed back then, maybe 2-3 years ago, when the Microsoft people showed up, in my office at the Pentagon to tell me, "Hey, we're going to have this Azure DevOps thing." And guess what? I was, I don't want to be locked into Azure. I want to run anywhere. Like, no problem. This is going to run on every cloud, and you can run it, yourself. That's a pretty cool move they made. And the tech stack is pretty deep. And of course, it's going to tie with, Teams and all these different things. And that's fair. They're trying to upsell their products, which is fine. I'm using Teams a lot with a lot of problems, so I hope they're gonna, particularly the GoDaddy hosted version. Yeah, that's the other thing, right? You have companies like GoDaddy try to resell stuff, and they end up, cutting features, and you don't have the full. Like I wanted a dial-in, for my meetings, and so it happens if you buy 365 from GoDaddy, they don't have the option to give you a phone number, which is like $2 if you buy it from Microsoft directly. No, I can't do that. I have to move my tenant, which, by the way, there is no easy way to do that. You have to effectively have downtime of your emails to move to the Microsoft hosted 365 to get the ability to have a phone number to dial in on your Teams meetings. And that's not a Microsoft mistake. Well, I guess they should probably not let GoDaddy sell their stuff if they can sell the entire breadth of services. But, that's how you get locked in, right? It's simple,
Right.
stupid decision where I just clicked on that, easy push button on GoDaddy instead of going on Mac, on the Microsoft website and buy 365 there directly. So you live and learn, right?
Yeah, I was totally unaware of that problem, but thanks for.
Yeah, just GoDaddy has a lot of like Office 365 features that are just not on their version, and it's just it's what it is. They didn't integrate, and you don't get access to the full dashboard on the admin side that you usually have on the 365 side. So you have a subset of the features. It's just bad. You keep finding, every time I look for new cool stuff, it's like you're lagging behind. What it reminds me of the implementation of DoD of Teams and 365, effectively lagging 2 years behind, the commercial region, because we asked so much of Microsoft in terms of security and nonsense on the government standpoint that they end up not being able to keep up with their releases on the commercial side. So effectively, your government version is lagging 2 years behind. That's kind of the same concept, except it's GoDaddy that made the mistake. So, all right. So last questions I think we got is Warren asking about a pretty interesting question here. He had a conversation with a friend, and that friend brought up that his company does not have a GitOps flow due to vulnerability of the cluster created by the GitOps repo. So effectively saying that, and I want to define a little bit what GitOps flow means to people. But he's asking, what do you think about possible attacks on someone GitOps repository? So two things, right? We talk about crown jewels, and there are a few things, right, that I think should not be hosted. The control plane of that thing should not be hosted on a multi-tenant stack. We talk about identity management. We talk about zero trust policy enforcement point. And the third one for me is your Git repo. I think you want to control that Git repo, and you want to know exactly. And if it's very important source code, it should probably not be internet facing and should be behind a zero trust, controlled policy enforcement point. So that's kind of the Git. And effectively, when you move to GitOps, your source code repo is your crown jewel. Someone gets into your source code repo. For us, for example, everything is policy as code. So if you get into my source code repo, you can change my identity management rules and all these things that get enforced by the identity products. So you get in Git, you effectively lost the battle, because if they can tamper your code, you're all done. So that's the first piece. Is Git is effectively probably your most important crown jewel in the organization once you move to GitOps and configuration as code and all that. So you have GitOps there. Now, for us in DoD, when we implement GitOps, it's a pull, not a push. So what I mean by that is we use Flux mostly, right? And so Flux is pulling from Git, and it's not your CI/CD pipeline, whether you use Jenkins, GitLab, or Azure DevOps. I don't care. The CI/CD pipeline don't have the keys to your production or staging environments to push into staging or into production. It's the opposite. Your Git repo has a master branch for production, maybe one for staging, and it's going to pull the production and the staging environment. Kubernetes cluster will pull from Git. So it's the other way. That the keys that the production cluster have are the Git keys to pull, and the registry keys to pull into that environment. And so effectively, your production and staging environments don't have ports open. Really, it's just a pull, and so that kind of mitigate the push. And so someone getting access to your CI/CD pipeline could do a lot of damage in other things, but at least they don't have the keys to the production staging environments. Although, like I said, if they get access to the source code repo, they probably can do a lot of damage anyways. So that's another.
There's an interesting facet here, right? Which is doing declarative policies, declarative authorization policies, right? Particularly for what's going on in your source code repo, right? That's one way of doing it. But then you also need to have a checker, essentially, right? Is the policy that's in my Git repository different than the policy that I expect to have? Are there different versionings, right? Being able to do a lot more control, and those are some of the things that governance really brings to bear. Because I might say that, hey, because this policy in my repo is different than my standards policies, right, for all applications, that maybe I'm not going to enact that policy. In fact, I'm just going to use my baseline policies or roll back to my other known policies, right, for this individual service or for this individual application, instead of just accepting whatever comes out of the repo as fact. And this is something that we're actually working on mitigating right now in our next version of policy management, because it's so important.
Yeah, that's pretty unique. That's pretty unique. We don't see this a lot.
Well, we hear these requests coming from big companies. Like we
what
don't
kind
know
of companies are leading? Like, are you seeing like more innovative or forward thinker on the financial side? I mean, what sector are kind of leading in that kind of discussion?
Yeah, so in this case, it's a big networking company, probably the biggest networking company that is digital transforming. They're reinventing themselves, and they're kind of breaking apart different aspects of what they do, and saying, hey, we're going to roll this out as a net new service or a net new platform that's separated from our other ones, because we know that our tech debt's too big on the older platforms. So let's try to build it right and build it again as a kind of a fresh, Netflix style oriented approach.
Yeah.
And we're seeing more and more of that. So, the embrace and extend the data, has to be able to move over, but not necessarily the underlying services, right, that make up the composite application. So being able to say, okay, and this is one of the beauties of microservices, I'm going to be able to transition, right, this function over to this net new function that's doing many of the largely the same things within the API contract without necessarily, having service downtime or otherwise.
Yeah, very cool. And I guess wanted to point out for people that are kind of talking about FIPS 140-2, well, since I helped the Rancher team, I don't know if I would credit the SUSE team just yet, but I certainly would credit the Rancher team that did it before SUSE bought them. But the fact is, it's not as difficult as you think it is if you do it right, and I kind of advise them on how to do it. So first, if you use a base OS that's already FIPS, you can reuse, RHEL or whatever, and use that as a foundation. So you inherit a lot of the stuff right there. Doing a FIPS OS is a massive lift. That's piece one. Piece two, all you got to do is swap the bits of your crypto to something like borrowing SSL from Google or whatever. FIPS, that it's already FIPS compliant. So they just swap the bits, the crypto bits for Kubernetes, for Istio, right? This kind of stuff, and swap it to a FIPS compliant crypto, bit, and that was it. So it's and then the process to get it validated by NIST, once you have an existing OS, existing lib crypto library, that's really, I think, even D2IQ and Rancher maybe took maybe 3 weeks to 3 months max. So it doesn't take a year. So it's not as big of a lift as people think. So that was my quick feedback. So I always give the last words before. It's not really the last words, because after you talk, I do give the dates of the next shows, but I give the last words that matter, I guess, to you before thanking you, of course, for joining us. It was a great session. We had a lot of people very excited about security and identity management. What would you like to share we didn't talk about before we let people go? And like I said, when you're done, I'm going to give the dates and the next guests coming on the show.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to just reiterate how fundamental authorization is, right, to your broader ecosystem, and how big it is, right? Authorization is what cloud was, 10 years ago. I mean, it kind of encompasses, well, not kind of, it does encompass everything that happens post authentication, whether that's from a person or a non-person entity, right? That authentication process is great. It's doing, it's doing what it needs to do, hopefully. But everything post that, right? Can that service talk to another service? What data can be shared? what protocols and what policy languages are available. All that really bundles itself into that authorization piece, right? Going up the OSI stack. And being able to fundamentally address it from an end to end, not just, hey, here's my user coming into my application, but also what is that application doing to all the other backend services is what we think of as like full stack authorization. And being able to pull all that together, report, govern, control how data is being shared is fundamental to how you're going to build your cloud services, as well as how you're going to adopt edge services. And that's what we do. So thank you for the opportunity to speak to it, and look forward to following you on YouTube.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the reminder, because I wanted to remind everybody, if you just reach out to 2 people that with so many people right now live on the show, we will blast through the 1,000 subscribers. So I would really love if you could do that. I want to get us in front of as many people as we can. We're fighting this fight to innovate and go faster than China. And for us, sharing this content, this technical information is so important to make American companies lead, and also the U.S. government as well. So I appreciate you sharing the show and joining us today. The next 2 episodes, next Tuesday, we're going to have Reed Notvoni, who is a member of Congress in Maryland, and also a colonel in the Maryland Air Reserve, and the former chief of staff for the Air Force, 2 Air Force CIOs, the previous 2 before Lauren. So that's going to be a very interesting discussion on cyber law and how he's been pushing, educating members of Congress in Maryland to understand a little bit better what cyber even is. So that's the next Tuesday. Member of Congress on at 1 p.m. And the 26th, we're also going to get someone pretty cool that you probably have heard about, who is Stuart Sheeler, who is a Marine that made a little bit of noise when he resigned from his time in the Marines after the Afghanistan debacle, and got into a little bit of trouble and managed to get out of it, and now is very vocal, like me, I guess, to raise awareness when it comes to the lack of leadership we see in the Pentagon to some degree, and lack of accountability. So he's going to be joining us also on Tuesday 26th at 1 p.m. Stuart will be taking your questions live. So we're going to get a lot of questions. So you're going to probably want to start posting your questions on the LinkedIn post we're going to have today, because we're going to get probably 1,000 questions for Stuart, without a doubt. So a lot of people are going to join the show. So I'm excited to have Stuart on the show. I wanted to thank you, everybody, again. Thanks to you for joining us and taking your time to educate us today on identity management and security. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks, everybody.